The world champion Mikhail Tal is known for his great sacrificial combinations. In the game I'm gonna show you, he also sacrifices material and carries out a brilliant attack. But still, this game is different, as the queens in this game are exchanged in the opening and the arising position is almost symmetrical and looks like a dead draw. But then Tal's magic begins. In a totally drawish position, Tal improves his pieces and starts weaving a mating net around the enemy king. In this video you will gain an insight into Tal's thought process and see how he managed to do it. Tal's opponent starts with d4 and Tal plays the Nimzo Indian defense, knight f6, c4, e6, knight c3, bishop b4. White opts for the Rubinstein variation, e3. Tal castles and white plays knight e2. The idea is to defend the knight and play a3 next move, and in case black exchanges on c3, white of course isn't gonna capture with a pawn, which would damage his pawn structure on the queen side. Instead, white of course will capture with the knight, keeping his pawn structure intact and getting the advantage of two bishops. Tal plays d5 and of course a3 followed. Now that the knight is protected, it doesn't make much sense to exchange on c3, so Tal spends a tempo retreating his bishop to e7. White plays knight f4, increasing the pressure on the d5 pawn. That's why Tal reinforces it by playing c6. White plays bishop d3 and Tal exchanges on c4 with a tempo and plays knight d7, taking under control the e5 square and preparing the advance of his e-pawn, which would liberate his position. Black would attack white's pawn center and open the diagonal of his light-squared bishop, which is currently a bad bishop as it's restricted by the e6 pawn. That's why white prevents it by playing knight d3, taking under full control the e5 square. However, Tal can attack white's center by playing c5, threatening to exchange on d4, and after e takes d, white would get an isolated pawn on d4. In order to prevent this, white captures on c5, and this leads to the mass exchanges. After knight takes c5, first the knights are exchanged, and it seems white was ready to agree to a draw. That's why white also exchanges the queens, and the arising position is absolutely equal. And it's hard to imagine that any of the players will play for a victory. However, by exploiting the slight inaccuracies of his opponent, Tal will create an attacking masterpiece in this game. Tal recommends in his annotations bishop d2 for white. Or white can also simply castle. Or he can play f3 preparing e4. In each of these variations the position would remain absolutely equal. But in our game instead white played b4, which at first sight makes perfect sense. With a tempo, by attacking the bishop, white has vacated the b2 square for his bishop, which is a bad bishop at the moment, as it's restricted by the e3 pawn. So white is going to play bishop b2 next move, and the bishop will be greatly placed on the long diagonal. However, the advance of the b pawn from b2 to b4 has a serious drawback. Namely, as you know, the pawns don't move backwards, so once the pawn is on b4, it can never return to b3, and from b3 the pawn could have controlled the important c4 and a4 squares. And now that the pawn is on b4, the c4 and a4 squares will become weak until the end of the game. Besides that, as the pawn has left the b2 square, it isn't defending the knight anymore, so the knight is also weak on c3. And Tal will exploit the weakening of these squares of a4 and c4 in a very skillful way, as you will see. But first he must save his bishop, so the bishop retreats to e7. White of course plays bishop b2, and now Tal starts to activate his pieces. First, the light-squared bishop, which is currently a bad bishop, restricted by its pawn on e6. So Tal plays bishop d7, and he's going to move the bishop to c6, and on c6, of course, the bishop will be greatly placed. Besides that, by playing bishop d7, Tal has vacated the c8 square for his rook. And in this position, white should have simply castled. after which the position would still be more or less equal. But it seems that white was playing in accordance with the endgame principles. And according to these principles, in the endgame, the king is better placed in the center of the board. That's why instead of castling, white played king e2, which again, at first sight, makes perfect sense. However, as Tal writes in his annotations, although the queens have been exchanged, the position still has a middle game character, because there are still sufficient pieces on the board, and although it's hard to believe, the white king will turn into a target of a terrible attack. So Tal now activates his pieces one by one. First, Rook c8 with a tempo, attacking the bishop. The bishop must retreat. Now Tal activates his light-squared bishop, again with a tempo, attacking g2. White plays f3. And we have reached a very important moment of the game. We all know that Tal was a great attacking player and he always found brilliant combinations and sacrifices. But the question is, what was his secret? How he managed to get the positions in which these combinations and sacrifices were possible? His trainer, Alexander Koblenz, tried to answer this question in his book, based on Tal's best games. He writes that one of Tal's secrets was that he was really good at detecting his least effective piece and finding the best square from which this piece will function in the most effective way. And after increasing the potential of all his pieces, Tal usually finds his brilliant combinations. And this game is a brilliant illustration to this principle. So his least effective piece in this position is the knight, because the knight is restricted by the f-pawn. It can jump neither to e4 nor to g4. The knight on f6 doesn't have any prospects. But Tal will now transform his least effective piece into the most dangerous one. Knight d7, a brilliant move, which at first sight looks like a retreating move. However, actually, it is a retreat in order to attack. So it's actually an attacking move. From d7, the knight can jump to e5, which would come with great effect. The knight would attack the bishop together with the rook, so the bishop would be attacked twice while it's defended only once, so knight e5 will be really unpleasant. Besides that, from e5 the knight will also target the weakened c4 square. Besides that, instead jumping on e5, the knight can also jump on b6, targeting both of the weakened squares c4 and a4. So the knight will attack white's most exposed squares. That's why it will become the most dangerous black piece. And in order to prevent knight e5, which would be really unpleasant, white played knight e4, opening his bishop's diagonal, taking under control the e5 square and preventing knight e5. However, this move, knight e4, lets black play f5 with a tempo, taking under control the important central e4 square and kicking out the knight from the central position. And if white's previous moves, such as b4 and king e2 instead of castling, were just slight inaccuracies, his next move is a serious mistake, maybe even a decisive mistake. He should have played knight f2 in this position. Although it looks absolutely unnatural, the knight is terribly placed on f2, it's restricted, it has no prospects because the f5 pawn restricts it, but on f2 the knight would have played a very important defensive role, defending the bishop. But instead of this, the white knight retreated to d2, taking under control the c4 square, and the knight is placed closer to the center, so knight d2 at first sight makes perfect sense. However, as Koblenz writes in his annotations, the bishop on d3 is even weaker than the c4 square, so it would be more important to defend the bishop from f2 than the c4 square from d2. And now it's hard to believe, but the bishop will turn into a target of attack. White has prevented the knight from jumping to e5, but the knight can still jump on b6, and it comes with great effect, not only taking under control the weakened squares, but also by moving away from d7, the knight has opened the rook's way, and black has created an immediate threat, namely rook takes d3, sacrificing the exchange, after which white will be forced to capture on d3 with a king. And Koblenz calls this combination a magnetic combination, because as a magnet, black will draw the white king towards the center, into the danger zone. And it turns out that after king takes d3, black is going to play bishop b5 check, and the white king will be in trouble. For example, in case white plays b5, attacking the bishop can retreat. Now white must challenge the active black rooks, because sooner or later white must develop his rooks. So the most natural looking move is rook c1, but in this case rook takes d3 would have followed. And what to do now? If rook takes c8, then of course before capturing the rook, the black rook is also under attack, Tal would have made an in-between move, eliminating the knight with check, and only after king takes e7 he would have captured the rook, and he would get two minor pieces for a rook, and that's of course is a sufficient material advantage for a victory. And in case after rook takes d3, instead of rook takes c8, white captures on d3, now we can see Tal's idea. He has actually already started spinning a mating net. So the king is in trouble. Bishop takes b5 check would be possible. It turns out that the king is cut on the c file, so it cannot move to c2, c3 or c4. It cannot return to e2 as the bishop controls this square. If it moves to d4, it gets checkmated in one move after bishop f6 check. So the only move would be knight c4. But of course the knight on the weakened square would fall, as it's attacked 3 times. It's pinned, it will fall, and black again would get a material advantage. That's why after knight b6, in order to prevent rook takes d3, white plays bishop d4, closing the rook's file and defending his light squared bishop. And we have reached the critical position. So black has improved, has increased the potential of all his pieces to its maximum. So both rooks are placed on the half-open files, the knight is greatly placed, both bishops are active, while the white rooks are still not developed, and the minor pieces, although they look quite active and centralized, actually it isn't the case. All these pieces are the targets of attack of the d-rook. However, white needs just a couple of moves to finish his development and to consolidate, for example by playing rook d1 and rook c1. And in this case white might think about equalizing the game. That means black must play energetically, and that means the time for the combination has come. And you can pause the video and try to find Tal's idea. So Tal sacrifices a pawn. It's time for sacrifices. e5, kicking out the bishop from d4 so that the rook's way is open again, and again rook takes d3 becomes possible. So what to do now? The dark squared bishop is under attack. In case white captures on b6, of course white is losing on the spot. After rook takes d3, now if the king captures the rook, then of course bishop b5 check would follow, and the king doesn't have a single square. The only move is knight c4, but of course black would first capture the knight with check, and after the king retreats, the bishop falls, and black has 2 bishops for a rook, winning of course. And in case white plays bishop c5, instead of king takes d3, white plays bishop c5, saving his bishop, and now the black bishop is under attack, and the rook is under attack, but Tal prepared bishop b5, defending his rook and creating a threat of the discovered check. The rook will move away with check. and the bishop on c5 is also under attack. The only move that makes sense is bishop takes e7, but in this case rook c2 is possible, for example. Pinning the knight, attacking it for the second time, and there is no way to defend it, and the black rooks will dominate the second rank. For example, if rook d1, then simply rook takes d2, the discovered double check, so white doesn't have time to capture on d2, the king must move, and of course that leads to checkmate in a few moves. So bishop takes b6 doesn't work. But what if bishop takes e5? What if white accepts the sacrifice? In this case, the most beautiful and interesting variations would have arisen. Tal gives the following variation. So again, rook takes d3 would follow, sacrificing the exchange, the magnetic sacrifice. King takes d3. Bishop b5 check, of course. King d4. So how to continue? Tal now demonstrates the phenomenal way of spinning a mating net. So, of course, black would love to play rook d8 check. But in this case, the rook would stop controlling the c3 square, and the king would simply escape via c3 to the queen side. That's why Tal found a great move, knight a4, after which his pieces coordinate in the best possible way. The knight controls the c3 and c5 square, the bishop controls the c4 square, and the pawn controls the e4 square, and rook d8 check, so the rook doesn't need to cut the white king on the c file anymore, because his minor pieces are doing it, and rook d8 check would be deadly. What can white do? He can try e4, for example, vacating the e3 square for the king. But it doesn't help, because still black would play rook d8 check, and after king e3, rook d3 check. The king must retreat to e2 in order to keep an eye on the knight, but rook d5 discovered check, and the bishop would fall. So again, black would get the material advantage. But even more beautiful variations would have arisen if white played, instead of e4, king d5. And now if rook d8 check, the king can move to e6, but Tal would have played king f7, keeping spinning the mating net. Now the king controls the e6 square, and again rook d8 check would be deadly. White can try bishop d4, vacating the e5 square for the king, in case black plays rook d8 check. But again, black would have continued his spider strategy. Bishop f6, taking under control the e5 square. And again, rook d8 check would be deadly. White can capture, but again, g takes f. Still, black controls all the squares the king can move. As you see, all these squares are under black's control. Black pieces coordination is simply ideal. And rook d8 check would be deadly. White can try king d6 in order to escape to c7 after rook d8 check, but Tal would have played rook c6 check. Now, if the king moves to d7, then checkmate in 2. Knight b6 check, followed by rook c8 checkmate. And if the king returns to d5, then rook c7. So a couple of moves ago, the rook was on c8, but now it's on c7. And if the king again returns to d6, now rook d7 would be checkmate. The rook would be defended by the bishop, and from d7, unlike from d8, the rook will prevent the king from moving to c7. White can try his last chance, knight e4, hoping that black would capture the knight, after which the king can capture on e4 and escape, but of course black would play rook d7 check, knight d6 check, and king e7, attacking the pinned knight for the second time, and there is nothing white can do against rook takes d6 checkmate next move. A very beautiful variation, but it didn't take place in our game. Instead of capturing on b6 or on e5, white played bishop c5. The idea is to close the c file so that the king can escape to the queen side via c2. But Tal still, of course, sacrifices on d3. After king takes d3, now bishop b5 check, and now you see why white placed his bishop on c5. The c file is closed and the king can retreat to c2. But it doesn't help because Tal continues weaving his mating net. Knight a4, taking under control the squares, vacating the b6 square so that black is threatening to play b6 next move, attacking the bishop, and the bishop will be lost as it's pinned. So white must move his king away from the c-file in order to save his bishop. But where can it move? It has three possible squares: b1, d1, and b3. In case the king moves to b1, a very beautiful checkmate would take place. So the bishop is currently, the black bishop is under attack, but Tal prepared the sacrifice, b6, sacrificing the bishop in order to open the c-file, and that would be followed by bishop d3 check, king a2, rook c2 check. Now if the king moves to b1, then of course checkmate in one, and if the king moves to b3, attacking the knight, a very beautiful checkmate would follow. Rook b2 check, king takes a4, and a quiet, beautiful move, a6. And there is nothing white can do against bishop b5 checkmate next move. So king b1 doesn't work. What if king d1? In this case, again, the black bishop is under attack, but Tal prepared bishop f6 with two threats. The first is b6, after which the bishop will be trapped, and the second is e4, which would follow, which will come with great effect, attacking the rook, opening the bishop's diagonal. The most sensible move is e4, so opening the retreating diagonal for the bishop and preventing the black pawn from moving forward. But in this case, still Tal would play b6, and he gives the following variation: bishop e3, rook c3, attacking the bishop. And now if white plays rook e1, defending the bishop, again the beautiful checkmate would follow. So again, in all these variations, you can see the great coordination of the black pieces. The rook is cutting the king on the c-file, the bishop controls the e2 square, and the knight checkmates the king. And if after rook c3, instead of rook e1, white retreats his bishop to f2, then knight b2 check would follow. And after the king moves to e1, knight d3 check. The king cannot return to d1 because the bishop would fall with a check, with a fork, after which the rook will fall too. So the king must move to f1 right under the discovered check. Black can play rook c2, attacking the knight. The knight cannot move because the bishop on f2 would fall. White can try defending the knight, but knight b2, discovered check, and the rook would fall, after which white's position would collapse. So king b1 and king d1 doesn't work. That's why white played king b3. But it turns out that king b3 isn't better. So the bishop is under attack, the black bishop is under attack, but white again sacrifices it. b6. It turns out that if white captures on e7, the c-file opens and the white king again gets checkmated after rook c3. King a2, rook c2 check. If king b3, then rook b2 checkmate. And if king moves to b1, then again a beautiful checkmate would follow, bishop d3, defending the rook, and there is nothing white can do about knight c3 checkmate. If rook a2, vacating the a1 square for the king, still knight c3 check would follow, also attacking the rook, and after the king moves to a1, rook takes a2 would be checkmate. That's why, in order to prevent the immediate checkmate, white cannot move his bishop, so he played knight c4. But of course now Tal gets the material advantage by capturing the bishop, and his attack continues. White captures on e5 and c takes b, reopening the c-file and threatening the invasion of the rook on c3. That's why white plays rook c1, preventing it. But knight c5 check. White captures on b4, attacking the bishop, but the king stands right under the possible discovered check. Of course, Tal could have played immediate knight d3, discovered check, sacrificing his bishop but capturing the rook. He's absolutely winning in this position. But instead of the immediate knight d3 check, Tal made even stronger and a more beautiful move, a6. more sophisticated move, defending his bishop, and it turns out that there is nothing white can do about the threat of knight d3, discovered check, double check, the double attack, the fork, the rook would be under attack, the knight would be under attack, so white of course cannot save both of these pieces. He can try king a5, moving away from the discovered check, but in this case knight b3 would be a fork, and again white is losing the rook. That's why after a6 white resigned. And now I recommend watching a game in which Tal offered one of his most famous and unusual queen sacrifices and demonstrated his great endgame technique. But first, like this video and subscribe, as it's really helpful for the channel growth.